Apocrypha. We're going to get through one of these days, but we've got a little ways to go in the Apocrypha. The blessing about that, unlike other things that we study with regard to the Bible, is that once we're through, we're through. Of course, in the Bible, we teach a message on such and such of a subject or an item, we always come back and review it because it's found somewhere else in the Word of God. But once we get through with the Apocrypha, we'll be through, except when we get to Catholic doctrine. And then we'll just, of course, give you some references. We won't have to say, now let's take a pause out and teach the book of Tobit, which took us 2 weeks to teach, so we can find where the Catholics got the basis for their works religion. We'll already know where that is. And so I can just say, now, do you remember about Tobit? And I'll give you a few details about Raphael and Asmodeus and the droppings of the Spera. And, of course, you couldn't forget once I remind you of a few things like that. So I want to come to another book tonight. It took us 2 times to get through with Tobit. We'll have to see about the book of Judith, Judith. The book of Judith. Isn't that the next one? Okay, I didn't look. I'm glad that it is. Someone would be in trouble. Let's see. I better go back to where I had them in order. Tobit, Judith, okay. Then the rest of Esther and so forth. Well, Tobit and Judith are a lot of alike because they've got, one's a female, one's a male character that's foremost in the book, but it's some intrigue, some mystery, a little bit of romance. Although you wouldn't want the romance of Judith, though.
That's right.
Sounds like someone's read the book. Well, someone said last week that I ruined their best book after exposing all the errors of the book of Tobit. So you know what religious background they were from. Well, it wasn't theirs now. I just mean that it used to be their favorite book. So I don't know if any of you like Judith. It's pretty good, but I didn't ever like it as much as I did Tobit. I just couldn't get away from Tobit and Asmodeus and the fish and all of that. But there are some interesting things about the book of Judith. So we're coming to another fictitious apocryphal book that has, just like all the rest of them, some type of underlying religious hortatory basis. Now the name in Hebrew, Judith, means Jewess, which is exactly what she was. She was a female Jew, which makes her a Jewess. According to chapter 9 and verse 2, she descended from the tribe of Simeon. So she certainly was a Jew, an Israelite. She descended from the tribe of Simeon. Probably her name was chosen. Of course, as I started off saying, we're discussing a fictitious apocryphal book, which means she's a fictitious character. Probably the name was chosen because it's just the female counterpart to who? Who's the most important character? Judas Maccabeus, because this is going to come. A lot of these books, remember, come during the Maccabean time period. And a lot of them are being written with the Maccabees in mind, whether the book's even about the Maccabees. It might not even be about them. But the Maccabees, and especially Judas, were so important the first couple of centuries prior to Christ because of all that they did. Now, of course, we know that the Hasmonean dynasty was, in fact, a literal, true historical dynasty. But that doesn't mean that all of the other books that have been written around Maccabees are true. So probably she really is to serve as the counterpart to not only some important women in the Old Testament, at which we'll look later on, but to the most famous intertestamental Jew, and that would be Judas Maccabeus himself. So it's a book that speaks of Judith, her beauty, her grace, her subtlety, feminine charms, her piety, her widowhood. The whole plot surrounds this one woman, Judith, who would definitely be the main character of the book, and a general in the army of King Nebuchadnezzar. So saying that much would let you know that you must know something about the time period of the book, since you know something about the Babylonian king, King Nebuchadnezzar. Now in Tobit we had, like I've said before, the namesake of the book is really not the most important character. Tobias, the son of Tobit, ends up being the most important character, and Raphael would have to come right in there, as well as Tobit, as well as Sarah, for important characters. Really, you only have 2 in this book. One would be Judith, and the other would be the general of Nebuchadnezzar. We'll get to him and his name here in a moment. The purpose of the book. We try to state some overall purpose. We even did this, remember, with Old Testament introduction. Books weren't just written to pass the time of day. There was a purpose for the book. And, as we pointed out in OTI, if you understand something about the purpose, obviously, it'll help you understand something about the book.
Amen.
People who study the book of Leviticus and they don't know the purpose for Moses writing the book, and they're always wondering, I wonder why a book like that was written. Well, if you keep on wondering, you not only will wonder about the purpose, but the contents of the book as well. You'll know nothing about them. But if you know a purpose, let's take even a better example than that, Ecclesiastes. You can interpret Ecclesiastes if you know some of the circumstances surrounding the purpose of the book. Otherwise, the book is not only contradictory to the rest of the Word of God, but self-contradictory. It contradicts itself from, say, chapter 2 to chapter 12. So, in understanding something about the purpose of Judith, we'll know what the author's mind was. The purpose is to enjoin on the people strict observance to Mosaism in order to escape all of life's calamities. To enjoin on the people strict observance to Mosaism so that they can escape life's calamities. So we're talking about the liturgical laws of the Mosaic economy. All types of rituals that were strictly enjoined upon the people, which makes it comparable to, well, let's say 2nd Maccabees. Remember, 2nd Maccabees was concerned about all of these strict observances. 1st Maccabees wasn't that much. Remember the story of Judas Maccabeus, how they learned the hard way that God doesn't really mean for you to strictly keep the Sabbath day, because once their enemies found out that they wouldn't fight on that day, their enemies attacked them on that day. And they had to face up to the fact, now, are we going to obey a technicality, a legalism from the Mosaic law that you can't work on the Sabbath, or are we going to go ahead and fight so that we don't die observing some technicality here? So that was very interesting and very important when you compare 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, Judith, with regard to what I just said, would be much more similar to 2nd Maccabees than to 1st. Because in 2nd Maccabees, again, we are confronted with strict observance to the Levitical laws. If you look over in chapter 5, Judith chapter 5, verses 17 to 19, we see that the repeated theme in the book is that God only visits his people with evil when they've done wrong. He only visits his people with evil when they've done wrong. Thus, the purpose of the book, the enjoining on the people strict observance to Mosaism, so that there's a purpose in obeying the law, so that you can escape all calamities. So the repeated theme on the basis of that purpose is that God will only visit his people with evil when they've forsaken him and the Mosaic laws. If they do good, in other words, God will bless them. When they do evil, then watch out, because trials and calamities will come upon you. Look at this, for instance. This theme is stated in several different ways by different people and on several different occasions in the book. One of those being chapter 5 and verse 17. Now this is the testimony of one of the Ammonite leaders, Achior, the Ammonite leader. And this is his testimony of Israel. Now, he wasn't an Israelite, not yet anyway. But he knew enough of Jewish history. As a matter of fact, starting up there in verse 5 down through verse 16, he's just repeating Jewish history, talking about the time of Abraham, Moses, the drying up and crossing of the Red Sea, and so forth. So here's what he said. Now this is a very important lesson. And of course it's a biblical lesson. As long as they did not sin against their God, they prospered. Well, Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, that's the cursings and the blessings. You do good, you'll be blessed. You do evil, you'll be cursed. For theirs is the God who hates wickedness. Now remember, this is an Ammonite king repeating this to the commander-in-chief of Nebuchadnezzar's army. But when they left the path that he had laid down for them, they suffered heavy losses in many wars and were carried captive to a foreign country. I wonder what country that was. The temple of their God was razed to the ground. Well, their towns were occupied by their enemies. But now that they have returned to their God, they have come back from the places where they had been dispersed and have taken possession of Jerusalem, where their sanctuary is, and have settled in the hill country because it was uninhabited. So verses 17 to 19 give us the theme of the book. Over in chapter 11, verse 10b, it's stated by the heroine of the book, Judith, ending with an E now, not an N. Chapter 11, verse 10b, where Judith said, "No punishment ever falls on our race, and the sword does not subdue them, except they sin against their God." That's the only time you're going to experience evil. That's a biblical lesson. It doesn't mean that now every time you have a trial it's because you've sinned somewhere, but that's a general principle in the Word of God, that if you'll live a righteous life and walk in all of His commandments, you'll be blessed. What other way could it be besides that? He doesn't afflict us with persecutions and death and sickness whenever we obey Him, but many times these things are allowed as either chastisement or judgment whenever we're not walking in the life that we have. So there are a couple of times you see the theme stated, which gives us the purpose of the book, which, remember, makes it, again, like I said before, like 2nd Maccabees. 1st Maccabees more or less told us that the reason that Israel had all of her troubles was why? Well, it was because Gentile nations are so wicked. And the author of 2nd Maccabees, he's not the nationalistically minded one, the militaristically minded one like 1st Maccabees. He's got a religious basis for what he writes and teaches and believes. And he said, no, the reason why Israel suffers is because Israel sins. Whenever Israel stops sinning, then she stops suffering, because the hand of judgment, that is the hand of God, is lifted. The author of the book evidently was a Palestinian Jew who probably lived somewhere around 150 BC. Which you don't have to get out your chart. We ought to know enough by now about Maccabees to know that that's right there in the Maccabean time period. I mean, even all of the Maccabee brothers, the Hasmonean dynasty, they're not even, they haven't even passed off the scene or died yet. Because it's only 17, 18 years before this whenever Antiochus defames the temple in the first place and desecrates the altar and so forth. So we're right during the Maccabean time period. In other words, we're talking about another book. That's why I mentioned the correlation between the name Judith and the name Judas Maccabeus, because we're again finding ourselves right during this very important period of intertestamental history, and that is the Maccabean era. So evidently the author is living during this time, and it probably would be a good guess that he's writing in view of the fact of some impending calamity. Of course, we know some of the battles that have taken place with Judas and the Seleucid kings and so forth. Maybe they're in for another major battle. Maybe something is going on in Israel, something that we don't know. But assuming that he is writing around 150 BC, and we know that we've just gotten over the time of the Jews finally winning their independence, that doesn't mean they never fight again. Perhaps, since this is what the whole book is about, this great calamity that has befallen the returned exiles in the nation of Judah, this great calamity that's come whenever it doesn't look like they've done anything wrong, and really they haven't, because, and they show that because they end up winning in this battle. Well, since the whole book is about a calamity that comes upon the people, maybe that's why the author's writing it. In other words, not only to encourage the people with regard to God delivering them, but the means of deliverance. And that means is observance strictly to Mosaism. And if they did that, then they'd be delivered like Judith and the other people are during her day. So assuming that you're following us thus far, let's go in the third place to the outline. To the outline of the book of Judith. It's going to be very easy to divide up. It's composed of 16 chapters, by the way, and all 16 really contain one specific topic. So that's always a blessing when you don't have to start dividing up chapters in the middle. So we're going to make 16 points about the book, but overall there are two divisions. Chapters 1 to 7, which give us the campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar and his general. Really, it's all preparatory for the introduction of the heroine of the story and the deliverance of the people of Israel. That's chapters 1 to 7. And then we have chapters 8 through 16, second half of the book. Chapters 8 through 16, which give us the exploits of Judith, who's the heroine of the story. The exploits of Judith. So you could entitle the first 7 chapters The Inroads of Holofernes, and then the last, from 8 to 16, The Exploits of Judith. Well, that's the introduction, so let's start looking at the book. Back to chapter 1. I think you'll find it very, very easy to follow. From one chapter to another, just like the book of Tobit, by the way, the story is building upon itself. The author's a good author. He writes well. The points are well connected. It's very, very easy to follow. It's very easy to understand. It's not as confusing as maybe some of the books of Maccabees that we've talked about before, where you're skipping around and you can't really tell what time period you're talking about. But it's very, very easy to follow from one chapter to the next. So in chapter 1, here's what we have. We've got Nebuchadnezzar, the king, defeating Arphaxad, who is the king of Media, at his capital of Ecbatana. Well, isn't it good to know something about various words, cities, countries, who attacks whom, which kingdom comes before which one falls before the next one, and so forth? So you already know something now about Nebuchadnezzar. Well, anyone from Sunday school knows something about Nebuchadnezzar. They at least know some stories from childhood about the book of Daniel. But you know something about Media, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, as well as their capital, Ecbatana, or Agmitha, as you find over in the King James Version of the book of Ezra. Well, let's see. Verse 1, we've got Nebuchadnezzar preparing. You see the end of the verse. He's preparing to attack Arphaxad, who was ruling the Medes from Ecbatana. Verse 5, it was in those days then that King Nebuchadnezzar waged war against Arphaxad, the great plain on the borders of Ragua. Nebuchadnezzar was opposed by the inhabitants of the hill country, by all those who lived along the Euphrates, Tigris, and so forth. So he goes on, verse 13. In the 17th year of his reign, when did Nebuchadnezzar begin to reign? 605, so you can subtract 17 years and see if that makes any sense. He marshaled his forces against King Arphaxad, defeated him in battle, routing his entire army, cavalry, chariots, and all. He occupied his towns, and when he had reached Ecbatana, by the way, let's go back up to verse 2. I shouldn't have skipped over that, because here we have a description of Ecbatana, according to the Palestinian author, the Jew of the book of Judith. He it was, that is, Arphaxad, who encircled Ecbatana with a wall built of hewn stones, which were 4.5 feet thick and 9 feet long. He made the wall 105 feet high. You know how tall 100 feet is. Now that's not improbable, because there are and were cities that had walls that high. But this just lets you know what Ecbatana was like. 105 feet high, 75 feet thick. That may sound like it's off the deep end, but there are cities like that. You just wouldn't think you could take a city like that. You certainly couldn't penetrate a wall like that. 75 feet thick, just the wall. You'd need a huge city if you're going to start circling with 4 walls, and they're all 75 feet thick. That takes up a lot of the inner part of your circle. The city gates, he set up towers 150 feet high. Well, they've got to be higher than the wall, because that's where the lookouts, the guards, the sentries had themselves stationed, with foundations 90 feet thick. He made the gates 105 feet high and 60 feet wide to allow his army to march out in full force with his infantry in formation. So there's a neat description of the city of Ecbatana. So that's what we're talking about in verse 14. That Nebuchadnezzar occupied his towns, and when he reached Ecbatana, well, he captured those 150-foot high towers, looted its bazaars, and turned its splendor to abject ruin. He caught this king, speared him through, brought an end to him, end to his kingdom. The very last part of the first chapter. There he rested and feasted with his army for 4 months. So chapter 1 is all about the defeat of the Medians at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Then chapter 2. In chapter 2 we have the plan and the execution of Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against all those Western nations, which he asked to help him in the war against Media, but which refused. And in this second chapter, in the 4th verse, Holofernes comes into the picture, who's the second most important character in the book. Judith the first, Holofernes, the commander-in-chief, Judith 2:4, or the top 5-star general of Nebuchadnezzar's army. His name is Holofernes, Holophrenes, Holofernes. Now I said that this is the plan and the execution of the plan, of the campaign against the Western nations that didn't come to the help of Nebuchadnezzar. And for this you have to turn back to chapter 1 and verse 11. But the entire region disregarded. Which region? A lot of these eastern nations, or these Western nations, such as Israel, by the way. Of course, Israel would be west of where Nebuchadnezzar is, over in Nineveh. But the entire region disregarded the summons of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria, and did not join him in the war. They were not afraid of him, for he seemed to them to stand alone and unsupported. They treated his envoys with contempt and sent them back empty-handed. So down in verse 1 of the next chapter. The 18th year, on the 22nd day of the first month, the proposal was made in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar to carry out this threat of vengeance on the whole region. What region? The one we just talked about in 111. Verse 4, when his plans were completed, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Holofernes, his commander-in-chief, who was second only to himself, said to him, well, all the way down through verse 13, go and take the region. So verse 14, after leaving his sovereign's presence, Holofernes assembled all the marshals, generals. He goes down, verse 21, marches 3 days all the way up into Turkey, devastates that land, Armenia, all of that region. And then finally, towards the end of the chapter, we see him swinging back down through Syria. Tyre and Sidon fall in the last verse of chapter 2. And he's swinging back down into Israel and the Philistine coast of Israel, which brings us to chapter 3, the short chapter of the book, which is about, chapter 3, the beg for mercy of the Philistine cities of Azotus and Ascalon. They send envoys. They're mentioned in the last verse of chapter 2. They're begging for mercy, surrendering in peace to Holofernes, the general of Nebuchadnezzar. It says in the last verse of the preceding chapter that the people of Azotus and Ascalon were terrified of him. Of whom? Well, of Holofernes. They sent envoys to sue for peace, saying, we are servants of the great king Nebuchadnezzar. We lie prostrate before you. Do with us as you please. Verse 5, when the envoys came to Holofernes with this message, he went down to the coast with his army, garrisoned all the fortified towns, taking from them these men. Verse 9, Holofernes then advanced towards Esdraelon, near Dothan, which faces the great ridge of Judea, where he remained for a whole month to collect supplies for his army. So all that, these first 3 chapters are leading up to, now how's Israel going to figure in with Nebuchadnezzar's plans? His plan was to take Ecbatana, but he wanted help from his so-called Western allies. When they didn't, then he sends Holofernes to level all of them to the ground. They've all been taken care of now except Israel has not mentioned by name. Which brings us to chapter 4. You see how one thing builds on another, and it's very, very easy to understand and follow. So in chapter 4, Israel is introduced into the story for the first time, and we see Israel's preparations against Holofernes. Israel's preparations against Holofernes. They begin to cry out to God. They're getting all of their grain ready. Look at verse 5. They laid up stores of food in preparation for war, for their fields had just been harvested. So it lets us know what time of year we're talking about. Verse 9, fervently they sent up a cry to God, every man of Israel. Fervently they humbled themselves before him. They put on sackcloth themselves, their wives, children, livestock, every resident foreigner, hired laborer and slave, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, men, women, and children, prostrated themselves in front of the sanctuary with ashes on their heads, spread out their sackcloth before the Lord. So it reads like times of impending calamity, 2 Chronicles 20, King Jehoshaphat, where a national fast had been proclaimed by the king so that this trouble could be averted. And this is exactly what we see Israel doing at this time. These are preparations. She's making, by the way, natural preparations with the storing up of the food, the fortification of the walls of the city, and so forth, as well as spiritual preparation with her prayers, her fastings, for crying out to God for mercy. The last part of verse 13, for many days the whole population of Judea and Jerusalem fasted before the sanctuary of the Lord Almighty. They cried aloud to the Lord to look favorably on the whole house of Israel. Okay, chapter 5 gives us the interesting testimony of Achior, the Ammonite king. Now, the Ammonites have not been defeated because they get over on the same side as Holofernes. And so Holofernes, in the end of verse 2, wants to know something about Jerusalem, Judea, the various cities in Israel, those very places which he soon has to attack. He wants to know something about them in advance. And so he asked Achior. He summoned all the rulers of Moab, the Ammonite commanders, all the governors of the coastal region, and said to them, tell me, you Canaanites, what nation is this that lives in the hill country? He's asking about Israel. Tell me something about them. He wants to know so that he's going to be prepared whenever he goes into the country to fight their inhabitants. So verse 5, Achior, the leader of the Ammonites, said to him, now we're going to look a little at his testimony, because this is supposed to come from an Ammonite king, and he is quite versed in the history of Israel. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Remember, over in the book of Joshua, I think that's chapter 2, that Rahab knew a thing or two about the crossing of the Red Sea. She knew a thing or two about several things in the past history of Israel, and she said that our heart has become as water just melted away for fear of you and for fear of the Lord your God. So she knew something about the past history of God's dealing with Israel, and so does Achior. He said, my Lord, he's speaking now to Holofernes, if you will allow your servant to speak, I will tell you the truth about this nation that lives in the hill country near here. Now he's talking about Judea, which is and was comprised of hills, not the plains up around Carmel and Sharon and Esdraelon, which were mentioned earlier. That was already taken. And no lies shall pass from my lips. They are descended from the Chaldeans. Is that a true statement? Mm-hmm. Abraham, Ur of the Chaldees. At one time they settled in Mesopotamia. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Well, when he left, he went up to Haran. Mm-hmm. Because they refused to worship the gods that their fathers had worshipped in Chaldea. Is that right? Joshua chapter 24 talks about the former gods that you served, remember, on the other side of the flood, which really means on the other side of the river. I hope you're following along in all of this. It's so interesting, such a blessing, because I think most of you are. We can just refer back to something very, very quickly, like Joshua 24, and the gods that our fathers served on the other side of the flood, and then change it to river, and you know what we're talking about. Because remember, that was a stumbling text for the flood theory, whether it was universal or local. If it's on the other side of the flood, it has to be a local flood. If it's universal, you can't get on the other side of it. You can go all the way around the globe and come back where you started, and you're not on the other side because the flood is everywhere. So it's good to know the Hebrew doesn't say flood there, it says river. They abandoned the ways of their ancestors and worshiped the God of heaven, the God whom they now acknowledge. When the Chaldeans drove them out from the presence of their gods, now that's extra biblical material right there. That doesn't mean that it's not true. I'm just saying it's extra biblical. You don't see the Chaldeans forcing them out. You see God by supernatural call calling Abraham out. They fled to Mesopotamia, where they lived for a long time. Then their God told them to leave their new home and go down to Canaan. Well, it's the trek of Abraham. They settled there, acquired great wealth in gold, silver, and livestock. Just like chapter 13 and verse 2. Abram was very rich, gold, silver, and cattle. Looks like you see someone knows their Old Testament. I mean, that's almost a direct quote right from Genesis 13 too. That they acquired wealth in gold, silver, and livestock. You see, the more you know your Bible, the more you can understand Judith. You have to know your Bible, and you can just recognize all types of things in the Apocrypha. But it takes a lifetime of study, you see, to know the Word of God. That's why we spend all of our time looking at these things. The more you know, the more you'll be helped to interpret the Word correctly. Because of a famine which spread over the whole of Canaan, well, is that true? Yeah. They went down to Egypt. Is that true? Yeah. And lived there as long as they were supplied with food. Well, that's true. While in Egypt they multiplied so greatly that their numbers could not be reckoned. That's Exodus 1. He's just taking us right through the Old Testament. The king of Egypt turned against them. He exploited them by setting them to hard labor making bricks. He reduced them to abject slavery. They cried out to their God, and he inflicted incurable plagues on the whole of Egypt, the 10 strokes on Egypt in the book of Exodus. So the Egyptians turned them out. Their God dried up the Red Sea for them and led them to Sinai and to Kadesh Barnea. There's all of that. They drove out all the inhabitants of the wilderness, settled in the land of the Amorites. They destroyed all the peoples of Heshbon by force of arms. They crossed Jordan, occupied the hill country, drove out all of the ites, and there they settled for a long time. And then that brings us to the 17th verse, which we started off reading. As long as they did not sin against their God, then they prospered. And he's just been giving us the history of that. As long as they stayed true with God, then he prospered them. So that's what all of chapter 5 is about. This remarkable, chronologically correct testimony of Achior, the Ammonite king, on behalf of Israel. Now he's giving this to Holofernes whenever Holofernes wants to know something about Israel. And get down to verse 21, where he's repeating what he said before about the sin versus no sin in Israel, and the calamity versus no calamity. And then he's giving Holofernes his own judgment about what he should do. If these people have committed no wickedness, then leave them alone. He knew from ancestral experience. My Lord, for fear the God they serve should protect them, and we become the laughingstock of the world. Which kind of is what happened to the town of Jericho and a lot of other places there. The laughingstock of the world. They thought they could keep God out by locking the city up. God just brought all of the walls of the city down. So in chapter 6, now Achior the Ammonite has given his testimony, and in chapter 6, old Holofernes not very pleased with it. It's an evil report. He said, should we go up and take Ramoth-Gilead? He said, don't go up, don't go up. Just the contrary, remember, to the Old Testament story. But he wants to go up and take it. So Achior is no encouragement, and so there's a lot of rumbling going on. The English translation calls it hubbub, which is certainly the English translation of verse 1 of chapter 6. When the hubbub among the men around the council had subsided, then Holofernes, the Assyrian commander-in-chief, said to Achior and all the Ammonites in the presence of the assembled foreigners, and who are you, Achior, you and your Ammonite mercenaries, to play the prophet among us? by telling us what's going to happen if we go and try to take the people. So he doesn't like that. So verse 6, he says, whenever I come back, the warriors of my bodyguard will run you through and add you to their victims. Verse 10, what he decides to do. This is interesting because Achior is going to come into the story over in the next chapter. What he decides to do is send off a couple of spies over to this city of Bethulia, which is, by the way, the most important city in the book, not Jerusalem. Holofernes isn't even attacking Jerusalem. You don't even see Jerusalem here. It's this town Bethulia, which is mentioned in the 10th verse of chapter 6. That's the most important city, Bethulia. So Holofernes sends a couple of spies over to Bethulia, and they take Achior. And what they do is they leave Achior at the foot of the hill so that the Israelites will take him in their company, so that whenever Holofernes and his men take over Bethulia, then they'll kill Achior along with all of the other Israelites there. So this is his plan. Verse 13, they slipped through under cover of the hill, tied Achior up, and left him lying at the foot of it, and went back to their master. These are the couple of spies who have been sent by Holofernes to the foot of the hill on which the city Bethulia has been built. So, verse 14, when the Israelites came down from town, they found him, untied him, took him into Bethulia, where they brought him before the town magistrates, then in office. And he has a little discussion with them. Okay, chapter 7, which is the end of the first section of the book. Chapter 7, we have the 34-day siege of Bethulia at the hands of Holofernes. A 34-day siege that just about reduces the people to death by thirst rather than starvation. Why? They cut off their water supply. Verses 12 and 13. He's got some people again in verse 9 who come and give him some advice to Holofernes. He said, save your army from a crushing defeat. What he means by that is, just don't attack the city outright, because you'll probably be defeated. Verse 11, now, Lord Holofernes, avoid fighting a pitched battle with them, and you will not lose a single man. Remain in your camp, keep your men in their quarters, but let your servants take possession of the spring at the foot of the hill, for that is where all the townspeople of Bethulia get their water. When they are dying of thirst, then they'll surrender their town. So you have to go over to verse 20. They blockaded the city. That is, they blockaded the city and kept water from the spring from going in for 34 days. Verse 22, the children were lifeless. The women and young men faint with thirst. They collapsed in the streets and gateways for sheer exhaustion. And then something else you can add to chapter 7, verses 23 through 32. We have a commission of the citizens of the city who come before the magistrate, Uzziah, or his name is spelled Ozias, a Greek way of spelling the Hebrew name. Here in verses 23 through 32, and they come demanding that Ozias, the other leaders of the city, the Sanhedrin leaders of the city, surrender. He said, we're all dying. It won't be any good for any of us just to hold out forever and ever if we're all going to die of thirst. So let's surrender and see what becomes of us. And Ozias in verse 30 said, no, let us hold on 5 more days. He said in verse 31, if by the end of that time no help has reached us, then I'll do what you ask. So you see how enchanting the story is. Not quite as heightened as the book of Tobit, but it does keep you going from one chapter to the next to see what's going to become of all this. You know all these various points must in some manner be important, or the author of the story wouldn't be providing all of that. So the first 7 chapters, like I said before, give us the inroads that Holofernes makes, first of all, throughout the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, and secondly and primarily, with regard and respect to the book of Judith, into Israel and this town of Bethulia. Then we said chapters 8 through 16 introduces to Judith and then detail her exploits. So in chapter 8, for the first time, we're introduced to Judith. And most of the chapter is made up of a discussion that Judith has with Ozias, the chief magistrate of the city of Bethulia. By the way, I can tell you a little bit about Judith. She's a widow. Her husband died of sunstroke, verse 3, which isn't unusual, except that it happened to a grown individual. Remember one of old Elisha's cases that he had to raise from the dead. The boy died of sunstroke. But that's just a little boy who couldn't take the heat. It's a little odd that a grown man who made a living out in the field binding the sheaves died of sunstroke, but that's what happened. So for over 3 years, verse 4, she's been a widow. I don't think I'm going to comment on that, except just to remember the fact that, because we'll comment on that later on when we sum up some of the apocryphal books and their false teaching, just remember that Judith is a widow. And a lot is made of that. As a matter of fact, when we get over to chapter 16, it tells us how she had many suitors after the experience she had with General Holofernes, and yet she didn't accept any of them, that she continued in her state of widowhood until the day she died. She lived to be an old woman. So remember that. We'll come back to it. Well, anyway, down to verse 9, here she's introduced before Ozias, and she has this long discussion. As a matter of fact, she upbraids him. Verse 11, you had no right to speak as you did to the people today, and to bind yourselves by oath before God to surrender the town to our enemies. That is, after a certain amount of time. And it's really, it's really a good faith teaching is what you have here. Look at what she says. Verse 12, who are you to test God at a time like this and openly set yourselves above him? You are putting the Almighty to the proof. You will never understand. You cannot plumb the depths of the human heart or understand the way of a man's mind works. How then do you think you can fathom man's maker? How can you know God's mind and grasp his thought? No, my friends, do not rouse the anger of the Lord our God. For even if he does not choose to help us within the 5 days, he is free to come to our rescue at any time he pleases. People set time limits on God. The Lord has got to, the money has to be here before the 31st. That's the deadline. Well, there's no deadline to faith. Faith just holds on to the end of the trial. And it may not be the 31st. It may be the 2nd. Maybe they'll give you 2 more days. You don't ever know until that day gets here. So she says, don't set a time limit on God. He can rescue us at any time he pleases. Verse 16, it is not for you to impose conditions on the Lord our God. Like we're going to give you 5 more days. And if you don't help us in 5 days, we're going to surrender or perhaps be slaughtered. If not, we'll at least have to go and worship the gods of some foreign country. And so Ozias in verse 28 says, you're right about everything. He said, no one can deny it. So she's right. And then she tells him, and the author of the book tells us in verse 32, that something interesting is up the sleeve of Judith. She said, I'm going to do a deed which will be remembered among our people for all generations. Verse 34, but don't try to find out what it is. So, of course, if it's bedtime, you couldn't put the book down. You'd have to get on into chapter 9. You want to know what that plan is that we're going to remember for all generations. By the way, I didn't remember it until I read the book. I didn't know anything about it. Only certain people remember it. It's because they've been taught false doctrine by their forefathers. Well, chapter 9 is easy to breeze over. All it is a preparatory prayer. Judith prostrates herself before the Lord, ashes on her head, uncover the sackcloth she was wearing, the time of the evening incense, and she takes off praying. She mentions, by the way, there in verse 2 that she descended from her forefather Simeon. That's all of what chapter 9 is about. She's praying in a preparatory fashion to prepare for this secret plan that she has. Chapter 10, we find out what her plan is, or at least the beginning of it. Chapter 10, we see that Judith is making a trip to Holofernes. She goes out of the gate of the city in verse 6. Verse 11, she goes right across the valley until she meets the sentry outposts. She tells them who she is in verse 12. I'm a Hebrew, but I'm running away because I know the city's going to fall into your hands and I'd be devoured if I stayed. In verse 13, take me to your commander-in-chief, Holofernes. Verse 14, they listen to her story. They're captured by her feminine charms. They're amazed at her beauty. And so they do just what she asks them to do. Verse 18, she's finally brought to the camp, and the last part of verse 23, she's finally in the presence of Holofernes. So this is the trip to Holofernes, chapter 10. Chapter 11 is her discussion with Holofernes. Her discussion with Holofernes. Some of this we'll come back and pick up on in some of the mistakes of the book. So this is the trip to Holofernes, chapter 10. Chapter 11 is her discussion with Holofernes. Her discussion with Holofernes. Some of this we'll come back and pick up on in some of the mistakes of the book. But she comes over, pretends like she's going to be a traitor to her people. And what she tells Holofernes is that she knows a secret entrance into the city of Bethulia that she can tell him so that he doesn't have to wait 5 more days or however many. Holofernes doesn't know, but wait however many more days until all the people finally die of thirst. So really she's going to give him a shortcut, shortening the time so that he can go ahead and take the city. This is what their talk is about here in chapter 11. Then in chapter 12, we have the banquet, the 4th day of her visit, verse 10 with Holofernes. He gives a great banquet, invites her in to eat, drink, and be merry. She brings in some kosher food and says, no thanks, I'll stay with my Jewish food. But she still is welcomed at the feast because of her great beauty and her feminine charms. We'll start with verse 16. When Judith came in and took her place, this is at the prepared, planned banquet, Holofernes was beside himself with desire for her. He shook with passion, was filled with an ardent longing to possess her. Indeed, he had been looking for an opportunity to seduce her ever since he first set eyes on her. So she's just giving him the opportunity that he's always been looking for since he first met her. So what happens? They've got this banquet. It ends up a drunken feast. Of course, pious Judith doesn't partake of any. She's got her kosher food with her. She knows what she can and can't eat and can and can't drink. But all of these other men, including Holofernes, those under him, and including himself, are just in a drunken stupor with this great banquet that they've had. So in chapter 13, we have to get into that to see what actually takes place. When it grew late, Holofernes' servants quickly withdrew. The end of the verse. The banquets lasted so long that they're all worn out. Judith is the only one that's left. Verse 7, she went to the bed rail beside Holofernes' head and took down his sword, and stepping close to the bed, she grasped his hair. Now give me strength, O Lord God of Israel, she said, and then she struck at his neck twice. A thick-headed, bull-shouldered individual, I would suppose. Or like some of the modern, or not so modern, electric chairs. You got to give them 2 jolts or half a dozen before they're dead. All types of lawsuits result over that. Inhumane punishment and death, which is exactly what it is. You're burning the soul to death, like the latest one that happened when they didn't have the protective coating between the electrodes and the skin. It just touched the skin and burned all the way through his skin, all the way through the inmate's skull before they finally electrocuted him to death. And people are in all types of trouble for that. Well, there must be a parallel. It took her 2 swings. Now, if you've ever cut wood before, it's hard to hit the same hole twice. So she must have been pretty good. Because otherwise, if you hit in 2 places, that's just like 1 stroke. Either it's going to come off with 1 or it's going to take 2. So that's very good aim. Just not a lot of power behind it. Good aim, not much power. Because she hit the same groove twice. with all of her might and cut off his head. Roll the body off the bed, took the mosquito net from its posts. They even had mosquito nets back then. Well, don't laugh at that, because the book was written in 150 BC, so they had to have mosquito nets at least in 150 BC. A moment later, she went out and gave the head to her maid, who put it in her food bag. Two of them went out together, as they'd usually done for prayer. You see, they already had this all planned out. They had been going out every night at a certain time to go wash themselves in the spring, in the river, and so no one would think anything is strange with them going out again. But look where they go. Verse 10, they go all the way back to Bethulia. So yes, chapter 13 is about the death of Holofernes at the double stroke of Judith. So of course she goes back to the city and reports to the city what she's done. Verse 15, they come out and they're praising God that she even came back. Verse 13, they're glad she got back. And then she took the head out of the bag and showed it to them. Said, look here, the head of Holofernes. The Lord has struck him down by the hand of a woman. So, chapter 14, her counsel then to Ozias, the chief magistrate, is let Judah attack. Because whenever Judah attacks, this is what she thinks will happen. They're going to be so surprised that we're attacking, it's going to make them a little bit angry and annoyed that these little ants would come out after them. And so they're going to go into the tent and wake up Holofernes and say it's time to fight. And they're going to go in there and find a headless general. And whenever they find that, they're going to panic, which is exactly what takes place. Verse 13, they came to Holofernes' tent. Judah's attacking now. Said to his steward, wake our master. These slaves have had the audacity to offer us a battle. They're asking to be utterly wiped out. So he goes in, knocks on the screen of the inner tent, supposing that Holofernes was sleeping with Judith, which is what Holofernes always had wanted to do. When there was no reply, he drew aside the screen, went into the sleeping apartment, found the dead body sprawling over the footstool, and the head was gone. A headless general Holofernes. Verse 18, the slaves have played us false. One Hebrew woman has brought shame on Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So all this is Judah's attack. Verse 1 of chapter 15 introduces us to the defeat of the army of Holofernes at the hands of these people from Bethulia. So we actually have the battle in chapter 15 as well as the victory. The looting of the camp, verse 11, takes 30 days. Then chapter 16, which is the end of the book, we have the song that Judith composes, as well as some of the concluding statements. The song and some concluding statements. She lives to be, for instance, 105 years old. Okay, that ought to give you a general understanding of the book. With the time we've got left, let's go into some of the mistakes then of Judith. Like we did with Tobit, let's point out something positive about the book and some of the statements that have been made here. This woman Judith and her story are very similar to some Old Testament women. For instance, her song. Let's look in chapter 16, verse 2 and verse 13. Her song is reminiscent of another famous woman in Israel, and the song that she sang is an antiphonal song. Chapter 16, strike up a song to my God with tambourines. This is verse 2. Strike up a song to my God with tambourines, sing to the Lord with cymbals. Verse 13, I will sing a new hymn to my God. O Lord, thou art great and glorious, thou art marvelous in thy strength and invincible. So, question 1 on your test is, to whom does this refer? Miriam, Exodus 15, verses 20 and 21. This is the antiphonal response of Miriam and the women. And Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances, like verse 2. And Miriam begins to sing how great the Lord is. He's triumphed gloriously. He's thrown the horse and his rider into the sea, like verse 13. So that part of the song is very similar to Miriam. In the second place, we see that it's very similar to the song and the experiences of Deborah and Jael. For instance, over in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 5, Judges chapter 5, verses 24 to 26. Deborah, remember, was the important judge, according to Judges 4 of Israel at this time, fighting against one of the wicked kings. And one of his leaders, Sisera, is being hounded, and he's finally smitten by a woman whose name is Jael. Deborah and Jael, their song as well as their experience. It's the song of Deborah, as well as Barak, the man who didn't want to go out without a woman to help him, and it's the experience of Jael. Verse 24, blessed above women shall Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, be. By the way, I wonder why the Catholics don't jump on that verse, like they do about the one about Mary that says she'll be blessed above all women. Why not worship Jael? Blessed above all women will be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed shall she be above women in the tent. He asked water. This is Sisera. And she gave him milk. She brought forth butter in a lordly dish. She put her hand to the nail, her right hand to the workman's hammer. With a hammer she smote Sisera. She smote off his head when she had pierced and stricken through his temples. Well, that's a lot like, except now it's a mallet and pegs as opposed to a sword with Judith. So there is certainly a similarity. Well, there's a song about the story. The story happens in chapter 4, verses 19 to 21. Judges 4, 19 to 21 is the actual account of Jael doing it, and then Deborah sings about it in the verses that we just gave you. And then I want to show you another parallel, still in this same account of Deborah and Jael. If you look back in the book of Judith, back to the Apocrypha, Judith chapter 16, verse 6. And we mentioned some other passages. We breezed over them, but I'll give you one here that we haven't read thus far. Chapter 16 and verse 6. The Lord Almighty has thwarted them by a woman's hand. And look in chapter 4 and verse 9 of Judges. It's very similar to what's said here. It says, the Lord Almighty has thwarted them by a woman's hand. Judges 4:9. Deborah said to Barak, I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou takest shall not be for thine honor. For the Lord shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Well, even the phraseology is similar between Judith and Judges. The hand of a woman. That the wicked king or the wicked leader, the wicked general, would be given to the hand of a woman and not to the hand of some man. So there are parallels between Judith and Miriam, between Judith and Deborah and Jael, and in the third place between Judith and who? In the Old Testament. The most important one of them all, by the way, except we don't see so many analogy or so many connections in the phraseology, but someone else is even more important. Esther. She delivered the whole nation. Well, that's exactly what Judith is doing. Because had Holofernes taken this one city, he probably would have taken many more as well. So she's in effect delivering the whole nation, just like Esther did. Remember, Esther worked her way right into the court of Ahasuerus, was able to thwart the plan of old wicked Haman. And so Judith, comparable to that, has worked her way by means of a banquet. You've got banquets all in the book of Esther. Has worked her way right into the court, to the harem of Holofernes, and thus is able to thwart his plans. So those are some interesting parallels. Let's go to the mistakes, the errors of the book of Judith. We'll start with the first one. It starts in the first chapter, in the first sentence of the first chapter. Which is what? Did you catch that? It's throughout the book. Right. Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, who reigned from his capital of Nineveh. Well, You learn that in Sunday school. But Nebuchadnezzar, you somehow connect him with Babylonians, not with Assyrians, and not in a capital of Nineveh. So the very first verse of the book is, well, we can hardly call it a historical mistake because any fool would know that's wrong. It's just someone who's just out to write a fictitious story, meaning for it to be fictitious. Because that's such a blunder to have Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, in his capital of Nineveh. It said in verse 7. It said in verse 11. It said in chapter 2 and verse 4. And then throughout the whole book, Holofernes is always referred to as a general of the Assyrians. It's always talking about the Assyrians, the Assyrians, the Assyrians attacking these people, the Assyrians attacking these people. And it couldn't be the Assyrians. It would have to be the Babylonians after Nebuchadnezzar and his fathers have already defeated the Assyrians beforehand. So the first verse of the book, and if you don't remember anything, remember the very first verse of the book. Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, and his capital of Nineveh. The second place, another military, historical, chronological mistake, is that Nebuchadnezzar never warred against Media or Ecbatana. Remember, they come after Nebuchadnezzar. They're the ones who war against Nebuchadnezzar. Media and Ecbatana, not vice versa. So he's got his history swapped around there. And you can put with that, we've never heard, there's no such thing as a king Arphaxad of the Medians. You can look on your chart of the kings, and Arphaxad is not the king around the time of Nebuchadnezzar. We just discussed all of that. You see how the stories are interweaving among themselves, intertestamental period, and what we're studying here in the Apocrypha. Because we've just covered who the kings were in Medo-Persia around this time. We just talked about the capital Ecbatana and what all takes place there. Ecbatana, remember, is taken over by the Persians, by Cyrus. And you don't even really find the Persians mentioned here as being important like this place Ecbatana and the Medes are. Another mistake that probably you couldn't catch because you'd have to know some things about geography is the impossibility of 221. Which states the following? I'll tell you what it says and we'll look at it so you'll know that's what it says. What it says is that Holofernes takes with him an army of, well, we'll say minimum, we're not going to count all of them, but we'll give the infantry 120,000 men. That doesn't count the 12,000 mounted archers and the rest of them. So he takes 120,000 men, marches them 300 miles in 3 days. That's 100 miles a day. You don't march that far in a day unless you've got an airplane or something. You can have all the camels and tanks or whatever you want to have. You're not going to go 100 miles in a day. 100 miles is a long way. And of course, obviously, does anyone have to be informed? We're before the days of the automobile. Verse 21, From Nineveh they marched for 3 days. And he tells us how many up in verse 15, 120,000 plus. And where does he end up? All the way up in Turkey, Upper Cilicia. 300-mile trip in 3 days with 120,000 men. It's an impossibility. Another thing we can say about the book, in the fourth place, is the fact that Bethulia is and was a totally unknown city. Now, we ought to at least have one reference to it in the Old Testament if it's going to become such an important city in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Really, of course, we're talking about the time of 150 B.C., which is when the book was written, not way over here with Nebuchadnezzar. But in neither time was there known in Israel a city by the name of Bethulia. You should have picked a name that is credible. When you pick a name that doesn't even exist, then it hurts our belief of your story. Another very interesting error in the fifth place, and you really have to wonder how he got all this all mixed up and backwards. We've already mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar is king of Assyria, and he has his capital in Nineveh. Then over in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, we're told that at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the people have just recently returned from Babylonian captivity. This is in chapter 4, sure enough. Chapter 4, verses 2 to 3, the people have just recently returned from Babylonian captivity. And not only have they just returned, but they've already got the temple rebuilt. Which, you got to read Ezra and Nehemiah. That was a long struggle to get that temple built and get the city of Jerusalem built and so forth. So sure enough, we're in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's an Assyrian, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar is, and he's ruling in Nineveh. And the people have just returned from Babylonian captivity when Nebuchadnezzar took them over there. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Can you believe this is right in the Catholic's Bible, dear friends? And guess what? The Catholic scholars know these things are there, but they're never going to tell the laity, though. They're going to say, don't believe that book's filled with a lot of lies. It is. It's filled with a lot of lies. That don't make any sense at all. But this is no small thing. It's right in the Catholic Bible. These famous stories like Tobit and Judith. But any of you former Catholics out there, do you ever know anything about Nebuchadnezzar or Ecbatana? Well, see, you can't check it out yourself. Why? Your leaders kept you dumb, so you couldn't check it out. And your leaders were dumb themselves, by the way. Only the real scholars at the very top know these things about the Apocrypha. They just don't tell anybody about it, though. Chapter 4, verse 2. They were in great alarm. Now remember, Holofernes, now that we've given you the outline of the book, you can follow along. For the first time, Israel is being introduced to the story in chapter 4. They were in great alarm for Jerusalem and for the temple. You see, the temple's built in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. For the temple of the Lord their God, for they had just returned from captivity. You say, well, Assyrian. They never returned from Assyrian captivity. That couldn't be it. There's only one captivity that we can speak of, the pre-exilic, the exilic, and the post-exilic time. And that's the Babylonian one. So you have to remember that during the time of Assyrian Nineveh king Nebuchadnezzar, the people had just returned from Babylonian captivity. And that's just a lot of mumbo-jumbo when it comes to history, because it's all wrong. It was only recently that the people had been reunited in Judea with the people that didn't go. The sacred vessels, the temple, the altar sanctified after their profanation and so forth, just like Ezra 1. The return of the exiles here. They're bringing back their vessels, and they've got the altar, they've got their temple. Down in verse 13, the Lord heard their prayer and pitied their distress. For many days the whole population of Judea and Jerusalem fasted before the sanctuary. Just another name for the temple of the Lord Almighty. So, of course, you're way off almost a century of time here, talking about the beginning of the inroads of Nebuchadnezzar and the return of the exiles and the building of the temple on top of all that. That's why I'm not kidding. They do make good bedtime stories, but that's all. Because they're not true. You wouldn't want to read them for doctrine or for any spiritual reason like that. Because if one thing's wrong, then how are you going to trust everything else that you find in the book? Okay, in the sixth place, another fallacy of the book, is the style of civil government in Israel. Is definitely a post-exilic government. And by post-exilic, I don't just mean after 536, I mean after 500 sometime, down into the beginning of the 5th century BC. The style of the civil government. What do I mean by that? Well, they have more or less a Sanhedrin that is in control in the city of what goes on with the various magistrates, religious leaders that make up the Sanhedrin. Chapter 15 and verse 8 speaks of this large group of men. And, of course, the book is telling us that it's being written, well, with Nebuchadnezzar, we're back, let's just say, around 600 BC. And you didn't have this style of civil government in Israel. That didn't come on the scene until way after the return of the exiles. Another fault of the book, but one blessing of the book, because it helps us understand the New Testament, is that we see many, many Pharisaic tendencies. Now remember, we pointed this out about some of the books before. that you see, just like in Tobit. Remember, with the three great deeds of Judaism that Jesus deals with in Matthew chapter 6, with giving, praying, and fasting. Now, you don't see giving mentioned in this book like you see it in Tobit. Remember, Tobit was almsgiving, deeds of charity, almsgiving, deeds of charity, over and over again. At least a couple of times in chapter 1, once in chapter 2, several times, 3 or 4 times in chapter 14 of the book of Tobit. Almsgiving. And we had one mention of fasting there, where, remember, Tobit, once he found out from his son that a dead man had been strangled outside, that he skipped his meal and he couldn't come back in. There was one case of fasting, as well as the prayers of people like Tobit at the tongue of his wife Anna and Sarah. That's all found in the book of Tobit. But here in this book, we certainly find fasting mentioned as something very, very important. We find it on several occasions. Some of it is national fasting, like we've looked at before. You can find those passages yourself. The one I want to point out is a private one over in chapter 8 and verse 6. And it's not the biblical form of fasting. It's the legalistic form of fasting. There was only one required fast in all of the Old Testament, and that was on the day of the affliction of your soul, which was the great day of atonement. That was the only one required. Now, when you read books like Zechariah, you see that they had picked up several other fasts during the period of the Babylonian captivity and afterwards that weren't sanctioned or authorized by God. And as a matter of fact, you read in Zechariah's book that God is rebuking them because they thought that was somehow pleasing to God. They had picked up a couple of more days out of the year to fast. In other words, it was being done for religious reasons. And the Pharisees really picked this up. The Pharisees, remember, were the ones who boasted, I fast twice in the week. The case of the Pharisee, remember in Luke's Gospel, and the publican standing there, the Pharisee told all of his good deeds. What was one of them? I fast twice in the week. That's 104 times a year right there. And all you were required to do by the Old Testament was one time, just one time. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't other times, but you can't say I'm going to do it twice a week, 104 times a year. And if you miss that, you're not a good Pharisee then. Well, we see the same type of emphasis here. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you see, come on the scene around the time of John Hyrcanus. So we're talking about this same period, the 2nd century BC. So when we study some things about the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the intertestamental period, or the class, we'll be coming back to these statements, to these books and so forth, where we see fasting assuming a much greater importance than we've seen in the Old Testament. For instance, look at chapter 8 and verse 6. Because remember, with the end of Malachi, if you don't have the Apocrypha and you don't study that, then as we showed you in the very first teaching in the intertestamental class, when you open up the New Testament, you don't understand what's going on. With Pharisees, Sadducees, why is Jesus always rebuking people for giving money and for fasting and for praying? I thought those were good things. Well, they are, but not when you do them like the Pharisees did them. And so where do they get all this? Well, you have to go back into the intertestamental period. After Judith became a widow, she fasted every day except the Sabbath. I don't see how she could be so beautiful like the book portrays her. She fasted 6 days a week. So not only do we have a Pharisaic tendency manifested here, but an incongruity in the book. After she became a widow, she fasted every day except the Sabbath. And the Sabbath Eve, the Sabbath itself, the eve of the new moon, Israelite feast and days of public rejoicing and so forth, which really didn't amount to that many days out of the year anyway. There would still be a number of weeks where you'd fast the whole week long, except until you got to the Sabbath Eve and the Sabbath day itself. You wouldn't have a new moon during that week. You wouldn't have a Jewish day of rejoicing during that week where you weren't supposed to fast, but rejoice and be glad, like Nehemiah 8:10 says. Don't be sad, but rejoice because the joy of the Lord is your strength. That's the context of Nehemiah 8:10. But here she's fasting 6 days out of the week. And she's a beautiful, beautiful woman. Well, the next verse, she was very beautiful and attractive. I wonder what her secret was. You would look like a bag of bones after that for very long. But she made the eyes of all the Assyrian sentries just drop out whenever they saw her beauty. Rather than saying, "My, you look like you've been fasting a lot lately." Holofernes wouldn't be interested in someone like you and his harem. He wants women with some flesh on them, some meat on them, not a bag of bones here. So not only a Pharisaic tendency, but an utterly ridiculous incongruity. No one fasts unless you fast Coca-Cola or something 6 days out of the week. You end up dying when you do things like that. Except maybe on occasion. I mean, Moses went without food for 40 days, but he didn't do it every 40 days. And according to verse 4, she's been doing this for 3 years and 4 months. Doesn't mean she did it 1 week or something. Anyone could do it. Well, I can't say that, not anyone. A lot of people couldn't fast 1 week, but most of us could fast 1 week if our life depended on it. I mean, maybe I could say everyone, if your life depended on it, you could fast a week, but not for 3 years and 4 months, though. That would get pretty old pretty quickly. So we can praise God we don't have to do that. Like those punctual Pharisees and like punctually beautiful Judith. Then over in chapter 12. Chapter 12, we have something else in verse 7. You want to look there and tell me what it is? Chapter 12 and verse 7. What does this bring to your mind? No one can think of anything? She remained in the camp for 3 days. This is after she's come over to the site of Holofernes. Going out each night into the valley of Bethulia and bathing in the spring. What is she going bathing every night for? People in those days didn't bathe every day. You had too much to do to bathe every day. And as soon as you bathed, you came out, it was 110 degrees, so the bathing didn't do any good. People didn't bathe every day then like they do in our day and age and culture. But yet she's bathing in the spring, she's going out every night. Well, don't you remember what the Pharisees were all caught up in? Washing. Got to wash the pots, wash the pans, wash your hands. You can't eat until you wash. These ritual ablutions or these ritual washings that they're involved in. Why is she doing that? Because she's come into contact with these Gentile pagan Assyrians. And to cleanse herself ceremonially from being in their presence every night, she slips out and washes herself in the spring. Just like a good, faithful Pharisee. So the author of the book, you see, already himself had some tendencies of the Pharisees. Because you look in places like, Mark 7, for instance, and the Pharisees are real upset with Jesus because his disciples came to the table and ate their food without washing first. And what did Jesus say? He said, you hold to the traditions of the elders. He said, you, by your traditions, have made void the commandments of God. He said in Matthew 15, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying that this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Oh, we're going to keep ourselves clean. Keep your outer body clean. He said that does no good. He said the inner man is what has to be clean. He said forget about the food. You can eat them clean or dirty. He said they go into your stomach and they do what they're supposed to do and you'll still live. He said it's the outer man or the inner man that he's concerned about. He said it's from the heart that proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, murders, fornication, and so forth. He said that's what you have to cleanse. So it was the good Pharisaic doctrine, and it's found right here in the book of Judith. So, some punctually religious ideas. And then in the final place, another error. Another of the major errors. I think this brings us to about number 8. The teaching, the moral of the book is, and I know you'll agree once I tell you what it is that the end justifies the means. The end justifies the means. By means of feminine charm, beauty, trickery, deceit, Judith goes into the camp of Holofernes just so that she can save her people. Turn back to chapter 10. And this is a popular doctrine among everyone today, that the end justifies the means. The end justifies the means. There's a certain end that we want to get to that we believe is a biblical, a scriptural end. And because it's the right end, then any means to that end are acceptable because the end is acceptable. Verse 12, about halfway through, she's been met by the sentries. I am a Hebrew. She replied, well, before that, something that I didn't read. Go back, let's start back with verse 1. When Judith had ended her prayer, prostrate before the God of Israel, she rose. That was the prayer of chapter 9 that was preparatory in nature. She called her maid. She went down into the house where she was accustomed to spend her Sabbaths and festivals. She removed the sackcloth she was wearing, took off her widow's weeds. When she was washed and anointed herself with rich perfume, she did her hair, put on a headband, dressed in her gayest clothes, which she used to wear when her husband Manasseh was alive. She put on sandals, anklets, bracelets, rings, earrings, all her ornaments, and made herself very attractive so as to catch the eye of any man who might see her. The end justifies the means. You can dress in a seductive way if your seduction produces the results that you want it to, by means of feminine guile, charm, trickery, and deceit. So that's what she's done. Now down to verse 13. She says, I'm on my way to Holofernes, your commander-in-chief, with reliable information. As the men listened to her story, they looked at her face and were amazed at her beauty. Verse 19, her wonderful beauty made them think that the Israelites must be wonderful people because of this one woman. And I would agree, if anyone can fast 6 days and be beautiful, probably your whole country has a secret that we need to have. Then over in chapter 11, verse 10, we read part of this before. No punishment ever falls on our race, and the sword does not subdue them, except when they sin against their God. But now, my Lord, you're not to be thwarted and cheated of success, for they are doomed to die. She's lying there. She knows that they're not doomed to die, so she's telling a lie here. Sin has them in its power. No, it doesn't. They haven't done anything wrong. She's lying again. When they do wrong, they will arouse their God's anger. That's true when they do wrong, but they're not doing it now. And look what she says they're going to do. This is the whole point here, which you don't have any proof of this in the book. As a matter of fact, the book tells us they're fixing to give up in 5 days. Because they've run out of food and their water supply is low, they have decided to lay hands on their chief cattle. In other words, they're going to take the animals that were designated for sacrificial victims. They mean to consume everything that God, by his laws, has prohibited as food. They're going to eat the first fruits of the grain, the tithes of wine and oil, although these are dedicated and reserved for the priests who stand in attendance before our God in Jerusalem, and no layman may so much as handle them. So she's telling a lie because she had just had a discussion 3 chapters before with Ozias, who said, no, we're not going to do all that. We're simply going to surrender. But of course, she can't tell him we're going to surrender if my plan doesn't work. Verse 16, so, my Lord, when I learned all this, I ran away from them, and God has sent me to do with you things that will be the wonder of the world. Well, that could have a double meaning there. Of course, she could be telling the truth there. And she is, because of what she goes on to do. But of course, she means it to imply something that is not true, wherever men hear about them. And then I think we've already read over there in chapter 12, verse 16, about her beauty. She seduces Holofernes with her beauty so that she's invited to the banquet. Everyone is drunken so that she can smite him and cut off his head with a double stroke. So that's really the underlying moral of the story, is you can do anything as long as it produces the right end. The end justifies the means, which, as I say, is a popular teaching among people, but which is one that's not justified in the Word of God. Now, in case you're wondering, in conclusion, let's go back over to the book of Judges, which gives us a similar story, and see what this account says. Judges 4, 19 to 21. Judges 4, 19 to 21. You see, we gave you this before as being the actual story of what happened with Jael and Sisera. We gave it to you but didn't read it. We read the song about it, chapter 5, verses 24 to 26. But now we'll read this account because here's where it's appropriate. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn in, my lord, turn in to me, fear not." When he had turned in unto her into the tent, she covered him with a mantle. And he said unto her, "Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." And she opened a bottle of milk and gave him drink and covered him. Again he said unto her, "Stand in the door of the tent, and it shall be, when any man doth come and inquire of thee, and say, Is there any man here? That thou shalt say, No." Then, and of course, she says that's what she'll do, because she just said in verse 18, don't be afraid of anything. And she's fixing to kill him, by the way. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent, or a peg, and took the mallet in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail into his temples, and fastened it unto the ground. For he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. Well, is this account here of what Jael did, is this acceptable in the eyes of God? Well, that puts us to Sunday morning ethics.
That's right.
So we're 2 days ahead of ourselves, so we'll wait till Sunday morning. If it's wrong in the Apocrypha, is it wrong somewhere else? Or is it wrong there? Well, that's ethics. The second question of ethics. May we speak of absolutes of right and wrong.